Jackson was important because Jackson embodied the advent of democracy, the idea that ordinary people could not only be represented, but could actually control the government. Jackson was the person who gave the presidency to the American people, and the presidency has never been the same since. George Washington was considered by most voters, in fact most voters didn't get to vote for George Washington, it was only in the Jacksonian era, for the first time, that ordinary people, not all ordinary people by any means, women for the most part couldn't vote, African Americans couldn't vote, but for the first time nearly all adult white males could vote. This is during the 1820s. And it's also for the first time that even those people who could vote got to vote for president. Well, strictly speaking, then as now, they voted for electors for president, but still they got to cast ballots. Before the 1820s, the electors were chosen not by voters, but by the state legislatures for the most part. And you may remember that in the 2000 election, when the vote got counted and miscounted and recounted and everything else in Florida, remember there was a brief moment when the Florida legislature toyed with the idea of stepping in and deciding itself how the electors were going to be awarded. And you may or may not realize that that would have been perfectly constitutional. Do you know that you have no constitutional right to vote for president? You don't even have a constitutional right to vote for the electors for president. All that the Constitution says is, you know what it says? It says the states shall choose electors, and it's up to the states to determine how those electors are going to be chosen. And if the Michigan legislature wanted tomorrow, or whenever they're going to meet, and if they decided to do this, they could say, you know what? This business of voting for president, it's a waste of time, a waste of money. You know, can't even decide whether you have another primary, but you know, we don't need the general election. Think of all the money we'd save. And so the legislature would just decide, we're going to choose the electors. And it would be perfectly constitutional. Now, it might be unpopular, and you couldn't get away with it. Why couldn't you get away with it? Because Andrew Jackson made the presidency peculiarly the office of the American people. In fact, it would be utterly politically impossible for any state to do this. This is why Florida backed off. And it realized this would never fly. Constitutionally, yes, but politically, no. Okay. Now, other presidents have exemplified this tendency of leadership sometimes to get too far ahead, sometimes to lag behind, but the most successful presidents to be sort of right where they're supposed to be. Do you know who? Well, here's something that I'll kind of pose as a question. Until 1860, Southerners dominated the presidency. There was that period of what was called the Virginia dynasty, where every president had been a Virginian, and then you throw in people like Tennesseans like Jackson and Polk. Until 1860, Southerners dominated the presidency. And then from the Civil War until, you know, when the next Southern president was elected?
Lyndon Johnson. Wilson.
Well, it depends on whether we're going to count Wilson as a Southerner. Lyndon Johnson was the first to be elected, then living in the South. Woodrow Wilson had been born in Virginia, was raised in Georgia, but then moved as an adult to the North. And he spent most of his adulthood in the North, in New Jersey. Now, do you know why there was this effective embargo on Southern presidents? And Wilson only broke the embargo by virtue of, first of all, having been an adopted Northerner. So most of the Southernness of Wilson had been rubbed off by spending a couple of decades in Princeton, New Jersey. But the other thing that made it work was that the Republican Party split in 1912. And so it opened the door for almost anybody the Democrats would nominate. Why this embargo on Southerners? And Lyndon Johnson, whom I'll get to, was a very good example of how it worked in practice. Why no Southerners for a century?
They lost.
Yes, they lost the Civil War, but it was more than that, because you could argue that the Democratic Party lost the Civil War too. But the Democrats made a comeback, and the Democrats were a competitive party again by the 1880s. But Southerners couldn't get elected presidents. Democrats, of course, could dominate congressional committees, and in fact, it was one of the peculiarities of national politics that Southern Democrats, who just got elected and elected and elected, and with the seniority, they rose through the ranks of the legislature, and they became the chairman of the most influential committees in Congress. No Southern president, because of the peculiar politics of nominating and then electing presidents. Now we're recapitulating, we're seeing again the peculiar politics of nominating candidates for president. But the way it worked in the South, here's the way it works. If you want to become considered viable for president, you have to have a local base. You can't run for president as a national candidate. There's one category of exceptions to this rule, and that is military heroes. So, do you know where Dwight Eisenhower was from? Yeah, although Texans sometimes claim that he was born in North Texas, but his father moved to Kansas very shortly after he was born. And so Texas can claim him when Texas wants to, and then they'll just shove him off on Kansas when the Texans don't want to. Actually, I have a student who's the grandson of a Texas governor, and he's working on a dissertation on what he's calling the Texas Troika of the 1950s. And this was, and he's decided to readopt Dwight Eisenhower, but he's looking at the relationship between Eisenhower as president, Lyndon Johnson as Senate Majority Leader, and Sam Rayburn, also of Texas, as the Speaker of the House. And it was a remarkable moment in, well, you could call it the pre-modern history of the South. It was also emblematic of how political power in the South worked. And I'll get to that. But the reason for the embargo was this. If you wanted to become a political player, you had to start at the local level. You had to rise through the ranks of state politics. This was the era of the Jim Crow system of white supremacy in the South. And in many southern states during the Reconstruction era and for a while after, and again during the 1910s and 20s, the Ku Klux Klan was strong in the South. In order to become a viable state candidate, you had to cultivate, or at least learn to get along with, the white supremacists who controlled state politics in every southern state. You had to warm up to the good old boys who believed that whites ought to run the country. And this was okay in the context of southern politics. But once you aspired to the presidency, then you were tainted with your white supremacist background. And so Southerners could rise to the top of the House, as Sam Rayburn did, to the top of the Senate, as Lyndon Johnson did, but they hit the ceiling at that point. They simply could not get elected president because voters outside the South would not, because one of the things I said, and I'll repeat it again, and that is that the presidency is the national office that peculiarly belongs to the people of the United States. And one of the principal reasons we vote for the people we vote for is that they represent something that we admire about the country, we admire about ourselves. I would argue that if you had to come up with a single reason why presidents get elected, candidates get elected president, is that they make voters feel good about themselves and about their country. Now, the feel good could either be looking backwards when you choose a war hero. It could be looking forward when Ronald Reagan, for example, was able to project forward from past the era of Vietnam and Watergate, and he would talk about it's morning again in America, looking forward, and the future is going to be better. And if you can do that, then you can get people to vote for you. But boy, for a Southerner who was tainted with this Jim Crow legacy, to try to get voters to vote for him, voters outside the South, it didn't fly at all.